There are a handful of books that have truly shaped the world, and the Bible is right there at the top of the list. It's influenced laws, art, whole civilizations. But what if I told you that the Bible as we know it has a history that's way more complex and honestly way more mysterious than most of us ever imagined? It didn't just appear as one finished book. It was pieced together, argued over, and edited for centuries. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain and investigate how it all happened.
Just think about this for a second. What if that Bible on your bookshelf is actually just one survivor from a massive, ancient library? A library filled with totally different prophecies, wild histories, and competing ideas about God and the universe. Well, that's exactly the question we're digging into. We are going on a journey to uncover the hidden story, the prequels, and the deleted scenes behind these incredibly famous pages.
So where do we even start our investigation? Well, funny enough, we're not going to start with the books that are in the Bible. We're going to start with the ones that got left on the cutting room floor. See, during what's known as the Second Temple period, that's roughly 500 BC to 70 AD, there was this absolute explosion of religious writing. It was a hotbed of spiritual and intellectual debate, and it created this whole universe of texts that surrounded what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. Okay, first up, you've got something called the Apocrypha. The backstory here is just fascinating. When Jewish scholars in Egypt decided to translate their scriptures into Greek, creating a version we now call the Septuagint, they included a bunch of these extra books. So get this, for tons of early Jewish and Christian communities, these texts were scripture. They give us this incredible window into just how diverse the beliefs were back then. Next, there's the pseudo-epigrapha. Now I know, it's a mouthful. The name literally means falsely attributed, but don't let that throw you. This wasn't about deception. In the ancient world, it was actually a sign of respect to write in the name of a hero like Enoch or Ezra. It was their way of saying, I'm part of this tradition. And man, these books are filled with some incredible stuff. We're talking mind-bending prophecies and deep, deep wisdom.
And then, everything changed. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century was a total game-changer. I mean, imagine finding a hidden library that's been sealed shut for 2,000 years. That's basically what happened. These scrolls gave us our oldest ever copies of biblical books, sure, but they also contained many of these other texts we've been talking about, plus writings from a very specific community. It completely revolutionized everything we thought we knew about this period.
I mean, just look at the sheer variety here. You've got the Book of Enoch, which describes a crazy journey through the heavens. You have the books of Maccabees, which are basically historical action stories of a Jewish revolt. And then there's something called the War Scroll, which reads like a literal instruction manual for the final apocalyptic battle between good and evil. The big takeaway is this. The world that gave us the Bible was not a monolith. It was a vibrant, messy, and incredibly creative place.
All right, so knowing about this lost library is one thing, but what about the books that actually did make it into the Bible? Well, this next part of our investigation gets into some serious forensic work, because here is a wild fact for you. We don't have a single original manuscript of any biblical book, not one. Every Bible in existence today is based on copies of copies of copies. So, you might be thinking, well then how do we have any idea what the original said? Great question. And the answer is a field called textual criticism. You can pretty much think of it as CSI for the Bible. It's this incredibly careful science where scholars act like detectives, comparing all the ancient copies we have, spotting the differences, and trying to reconstruct what the original document most likely said.
So, how does this detective work actually play out? Well, it's a painstaking process. First, they gather every single ancient copy they can get their hands on from all over the world. Then, they lay them out side by side and hunt for every single difference, no matter how small. And finally, using a whole set of established rules, they work backwards to figure out which version is most likely the oldest, the most original reading.
So, how did these changes even happen in the first place? Well, they happen in two main ways. You had unintentional errors, an exhausted scribe mishears a word or his eye skips a line, just honest mistakes. But then you also had intentional changes. A scribe might think a passage is confusing and try to fix it, or maybe he'd add a little detail to make a theological point stronger. It happened all the time.
Now it's really, really important to understand the goal here. This kind of critical work isn't about attacking the Bible or trying to undermine it, not at all. It's actually an act of recovery. The whole point is to peel back those centuries of copies and changes to get as close as humanly possible to what was originally written down. Okay. So now we've got our investigative toolkit, right? We know there was this whole world of lost books out there, and we know how scholars analyze the books that we do have.
So with these tools in hand, we can now approach one of the most compelling and, let's be honest, debated figures in all of human history, the historical Jesus. To do this as historians, you have to make a really crucial distinction. On one hand, you have the Jesus of history. That's the real person, the Jewish teacher who lived and died in first-century Galilee. On the other hand, you have the Christ of faith, the divine figure of Christian theology and worship. Making this distinction allows historians to do their work while also respecting the deep religious meaning these texts have for billions of people.
So what does this investigation into the historical Jesus actually find? Well, here's where it gets wild. There is no single answer. You have brilliant scholars using the exact same methods, looking at the exact same evidence, and they come to completely different conclusions. Was he an apocalyptic prophet? A wise wandering teacher? A social revolutionary? A messiah? The fact that all of these are plausible just shows you how complex the evidence really is.
I think this quote from the scholar N.T. Wright just nails the mindset you need for this kind of search. It's about humility. It's about recognizing that we approach this distant past as outsiders. The whole point of the historical search is that it forces us to question what we think we know and to see things with fresh eyes.
So, after all that, where does it leave us? What's the final verdict from our investigation into the Bible's hidden history? Well, the truth is, the case is anything but closed. In fact, what we've really discovered isn't one simple answer, but a much bigger, richer, and way more complicated picture.
So let's just quickly recap the evidence we've looked at. We've seen that the Bible isn't really a single book, it's more like a library, chosen from an even bigger library. We've learned that all those lost texts show us just how diverse ancient thinking was. We found out that the text we read today is the result of some incredible scientific detective work. And maybe most importantly, this whole search doesn't give us easy answers, but instead invites us into a fascinating, ongoing debate.
And, that really is the main takeaway here. Learning about this messy, complex history doesn't take anything away from the Bible. For a lot of people, it actually adds so much more. It shows you the incredible human story of how these texts were debated and treasured and copied and passed down through the centuries. It turns it from a stone monument into a living, breathing piece of human history.
So I'll just leave you with this final question to chew on. Does knowing the complicated, messy, deeply human story behind a book like this make it less important? Or does it maybe make it infinitely more fascinating, more relatable, and maybe even more profound? That's something to think about.